The night air over the Mekong Delta was thick, warm, and heavy with humidity. It was the kind of darkness that swallowed shapes and blurred the line between water and land. The jungle was alive with sound. Insects buzzing, frogs croaking, distant rustling somewhere in the mangroves. Yet on the narrow canal cutting through the swamp, one small patrol boat moved almost silently. Inside the boat sat 6 men from the United States Navy SEALs. Their faces were painted black and green, their uniforms soaked from the humid night air, and their eyes fixed on the shadowy shoreline ahead. No one spoke. The only sound was the gentle push of water against the aluminum hull as the boat drifted forward with the engine barely above idle. The point man sat at the bow, his weapon resting across his lap. If someone had expected him to be carrying the most modern American rifle of the war, they would have been surprised. It was not the famous M16 rifle that most American soldiers carried in Vietnam. It wasn't even the compact Israeli submachine gun that was rapidly gaining a reputation around the world. Instead, the weapon in his hands had been designed thousands of miles away, in a neutral European country far removed from the jungles of Southeast Asia. The weapon was the Carl Gustaf M45. Among American special operators, it had a simpler nickname, the Swedish K. In the darkness of the Delta, the gun looked almost crude. It had a tubular receiver, a folding metal stock, and a long cylindrical suppressor attached to the front. It didn't look futuristic. It didn't look sophisticated. In fact, it looked almost primitive. But the SEAL holding it trusted it with his life. And in the unpredictable chaos of the Vietnam War, that trust meant everything. Because in the jungles and waterways of Vietnam, weapons had a habit of failing at the worst possible moment. Mud got into everything. Water seeped into every moving part. Fine grains of sand found their way into chambers, bolts, and magazines. Rifles jammed, pistols malfunctioned. And when a weapon failed in the middle of a firefight, it could mean the difference between walking away and never making it home. But the Swedish K had developed a reputation among special operators for something extremely valuable: reliability. In fact, many SEALs believed it was one of the most dependable guns they had ever used. That reputation didn't come from advertisements or factory testing. It came from real missions, from night raids, ambushes, and silent infiltrations deep inside enemy territory. The patrol boat drifted closer to the bank. The engine was cut completely now. One of the men quietly pushed the boat forward with a paddle, guiding it between mangrove roots and floating debris. The SEAL at the bow lifted the Swedish K and rested the stock against his shoulder. Through the dark shapes of the trees, faint lights could be seen in the distance. A small riverside village, barely visible through the jungle. Tonight's mission was simple on paper. Move quietly into the village, capture a suspected Viet Cong courier, extract before dawn. But nothing in Vietnam was ever truly simple. And in missions like this, silence was often more important than firepower. That was one of the reasons the Swedish K had become so valuable to special operators. When fitted with a suppressor, the weapon produced a dull mechanical cough instead of the sharp crack of a rifle. In the humid night air of the Delta, that sound could easily be mistaken for something else. A door closing, a bamboo pole snapping, a distant firecracker. It allowed SEAL teams to eliminate sentries or engage targets without immediately alerting everyone in the area. But the Swedish K's reputation didn't come from silence alone. It came from how perfectly the weapon fit the brutal environment of Vietnam. To understand why this simple Swedish submachine gun earned such respect among American special operators, we have to step back and look at the world those SEALs were fighting in. Because the Vietnam War was unlike almost any other conflict the United States had fought before. The war was not fought across open battlefields or along clearly defined front lines. Instead, it was fought in dense jungles, muddy rice paddies, narrow river channels, and remote villages scattered across the countryside. Visibility was often limited to just a few dozen meters. The enemy could appear suddenly from the trees and disappear just as quickly. For conventional forces, this environment was already difficult. For special operations units like the Navy SEALs, it was even more challenging. The SEAL teams operating in Vietnam were small, often just a handful of men, and their missions required them to move quietly through hostile territory, gather intelligence, ambush enemy units, or capture key personnel. They often operated at night. They frequently traveled by boat through the maze of waterways that made up the Mekong Delta. These operations demanded a very specific kind of weapon. It needed to be compact enough for close quarters fighting. It needed to be controllable during rapid bursts of fire. It needed to function reliably in mud, water, and tropical heat. And ideally, it needed to work well with a suppressor for stealth operations. At first glance, one might assume that the perfect weapon for that role would have been the famous Israeli submachine gun known as the Uzi. Compact, rugged, and widely used around the world, the Uzi had already built a reputation as one of the most successful SMGs ever designed. Yet among many SEALs in Vietnam, another weapon quietly took its place as a favorite: the Swedish K. And the story of how that weapon found its way into the hands of American special operators is almost as interesting as the weapon itself. The Carl Gustaf M45 had been designed in Sweden shortly after the end of the Second World War. At the time, many countries were rethinking their military equipment based on the lessons learned during the war. Submachine guns had proven extremely effective in close quarters fighting, particularly in urban combat and jungle warfare. Swedish engineers focused on a design philosophy that prioritized simplicity above all else. Rather than creating a complex weapon with tight tolerances and delicate parts, they built a gun that could withstand abuse. The receiver was essentially a steel tube. The bolt was large and heavy. The internal mechanism was straightforward and easy to maintain. In other words, the weapon was designed to keep working even under terrible conditions. And those conditions were exactly what soldiers would face in Vietnam. The Swedish K fired the standard 9x19mm cartridge and used a simple blowback operating system. Its rate of fire was moderate, around 600 rounds per minute, which allowed shooters to control short bursts more easily than with some faster submachine guns. The magazines typically held 36 rounds, providing a balance between capacity and reliability. But what truly set the weapon apart was how forgiving it was. If dirt entered the mechanism, the large clearances inside the receiver often allowed the gun to keep functioning. If the weapon was exposed to moisture or mud, it was usually easy to clean and get back into operation. Compared to more complicated firearms, the Swedish K was almost difficult to break, and in the chaotic environment of guerrilla warfare, that durability was priceless. By the early years of American involvement in Vietnam, small numbers of these Swedish submachine guns had already begun appearing in the hands of U.S. personnel. Some were acquired through special procurement channels. Others were used by covert units operating under the supervision of the Central Intelligence Agency. When Navy SEAL teams began operating extensively in the Mekong Delta, they quickly discovered that the Swedish K fit their needs remarkably well. It was compact enough to maneuver inside boats and narrow jungle paths. It was controllable during rapid fire, and perhaps most importantly, it could be fitted with an effective suppressor for silent operations. Before long, many SEAL operators began requesting the weapon specifically. In the strange and unpredictable world of Vietnam's Riverine warfare, a simple Swedish submachine gun had become one of the most trusted tools a special operator could carry. And as more missions unfolded in the jungles and waterways of the Delta, the reputation of the Swedish K would only continue to grow. But to truly understand why so many SEALs preferred it, sometimes over the famous Uzi, we need to look closer at what actually happened when these weapons were put to the test in real combat. Because in Vietnam, theory didn't matter. Only what worked in the jungle did. To understand why the Swedish K earned such loyalty from American special operators, you first have to understand the battlefield they were fighting on. Vietnam was not a war of open deserts or sweeping tank battles. It was a war fought in thick jungle, muddy rice fields, and tangled river systems that stretched for hundreds of miles. Nowhere was this environment more challenging than the vast maze of waterways known as the Mekong Delta. The delta was a labyrinth of canals, tributaries, swamps, and flooded forest. In some areas, the land seemed barely distinguishable from the water. Villages sat on narrow strips of dry ground, surrounded by muddy channels that could hide boats, fighters, and supply routes. For the enemy, the delta was an ideal environment for guerrilla warfare. For American forces, it was a nightmare of uncertainty. The units tasked with operating in this environment often traveled by boat, moving quietly through narrow waterways under the cover of darkness. Among the most famous of these forces were the small teams of the United States Navy SEALs. Their operations in the Delta were unlike traditional military missions. Instead of large formations, SEAL teams usually consisted of only a handful of men. Their goal was not to occupy territory, but to strike quickly, gather intelligence, or disrupt enemy operations before disappearing back into the darkness. They conducted ambushes along jungle trails, raids on suspected Viet Cong safe houses, and surveillance missions deep inside enemy territory. Many of these operations took place at night, when stealth was essential and visibility was often limited to the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the water. In these conditions, weapons were more than tools. They were lifelines. A SEAL team operating miles from friendly support had to trust that every piece of equipment would function perfectly when needed. Unfortunately, the brutal environment of Vietnam had a way of exposing the weaknesses of even the most advanced technology. Mud was everywhere. Thick brown sludge clung to boots, clothing, and weapons alike. A single misstep could plunge a soldier knee-deep into swamp water. Rainstorms appeared suddenly and drenched everything within minutes. Moisture seeped into gear bags and weapon mechanisms. Over time, the combination of mud, humidity, and vegetation could turn a precision firearm into a stubborn piece of metal that refused to cooperate. During the early years of the war, many American troops carried the newly introduced M16 rifle. The weapon would eventually become one of the most recognizable rifles in military history, but its early deployment in Vietnam was far from smooth. Initial models suffered from reliability problems that became infamous among soldiers in the field. Powder fouling accumulated quickly in the chamber, and without proper cleaning equipment or instructions, rifles sometimes jammed during combat. Although many of these issues were later corrected through modifications and improved training, the experience left a lasting impression on troops who had faced the terrifying moment of pulling the trigger only to hear a dull click instead of a shot. For special operators like the SEALs, such uncertainty was unacceptable. Their missions often involved small teams, operating far from reinforcements, sometimes deep inside hostile territory. If a weapon malfunctioned during a firefight, there might be no backup. The fight could be over before help arrived. Because of this, many SEAL operators became extremely selective about the weapons they carried. They wanted firearms that were simple, durable, and reliable above all else. This was where the Swedish submachine gun quietly began to stand out. The Carl Gustaf M45 had never been designed specifically for jungle warfare. Yet its construction made it surprisingly well suited for exactly that environment. Unlike some firearms with tightly fitted components, the Swedish K used a straightforward blowback system with generous internal clearances. The bolt was large and heavy, sliding inside the tubular receiver with relatively little sensitivity to dirt or debris. If mud entered the mechanism, the weapon often continued functioning long enough for the operator to clear it. If water splashed into the receiver during a river crossing, the gun usually fired without hesitation once it was raised and aimed. Many SEAL veterans later recalled how forgiving the weapon seemed compared to other firearms they had used. In the Delta, soldiers were constantly climbing in and out of boats, crawling through muddy banks, and pushing through thick vegetation. Weapons inevitably became dirty. A firearm that required perfect cleanliness simply wasn't practical in that environment. The Swedish K, however, tolerated abuse remarkably well. Another advantage was its moderate rate of fire. The Swedish K fired at roughly 600 rounds per minute, which created a rhythm that experienced shooters could control easily. When firing short bursts, the weapon tended to climb less than faster submachine guns. This allowed SEAL operators to keep their shots on target during rapid engagements. In close quarters fighting, which was common in the narrow paths and huts of Delta villages, that control could make a significant difference. But the environment of Vietnam created another tactical requirement that would further elevate the reputation of the Swedish K: silence. Many SEAL missions depended on stealth. Teams often approached targets under cover of darkness, moving through mangrove channels or creeping along jungle trails to reach their objectives. If a sentry spotted them too early, the entire operation could unravel within seconds. In those situations, eliminating a guard quietly could determine whether a mission succeeded or failed. Submachine guns firing standard ammunition were never truly silent, even when equipped with suppressors. Yet some weapons worked better with suppressors than others. The Swedish K developed a particularly strong reputation in this area. When fitted with a well-designed suppressor, the gun produced a dull mechanical thud rather than a sharp crack. At moderate distances, that sound blended into the background noise of the jungle. Combined with subsonic ammunition, it allowed SEAL teams to engage targets discreetly without immediately alerting everyone nearby. This capability was invaluable during reconnaissance and capture missions. Rather than launching loud assaults that could draw enemy reinforcements, SEAL teams could move quietly through an area, neutralizing threats only when necessary. The suppressor did not make the weapon completely silent, but it reduced the signature enough to preserve the element of surprise. Of course, the Swedish K was not the only submachine gun available during the war. Around the same time, another weapon was gaining attention among military forces around the world: the compact Israeli design known as the Uzi. The Uzi had been developed after the creation of the State of Israel and quickly earned a reputation as a rugged and practical firearm. Its distinctive boxy shape and magazine housed in the pistol grip made it extremely compact, ideal for vehicle crews and close-quarters fighting. Many security forces and military units adopted the weapon because of its durability and ease of use. In theory, the Uzi should have been perfectly suited for special operations. It was small, reliable, and widely available. Yet when some SEAL teams compared the two weapons in real jungle conditions, many of them continued to favor the Swedish K. Part of the reason was balance. The Swedish K had a longer receiver and a folding stock that gave it a more stable feel when firing bursts. Operators often found it easier to keep the weapon steady during rapid fire, especially when firing from awkward positions in boats or dense vegetation. Another factor was how the Swedish K handled suppressors. Although the Uzi could certainly be suppressed, many SEAL operators felt the Swedish weapon produced smoother and more consistent performance when used in stealth operations. But perhaps the most important reason was simpler than any technical comparison: trust. In the unforgiving environment of the Mekong Delta, soldiers quickly developed strong opinions about which equipment worked and which did not. Reputation spread through word of mouth, mission after mission. If a weapon performed well during a dangerous operation, the story traveled quickly among units. Over time, the Swedish K developed a quiet legend among the SEAL teams who relied on it. It was not flashy, it was not the newest design, but it worked. And in Vietnam, that was often the only characteristic that truly mattered. As the war continued and SEAL teams conducted more operations throughout the Delta, the Swedish K would become associated with some of the most daring missions carried out by American special operators. Ambushes along remote canals, night raids on jungle villages, intelligence gathering operations deep inside enemy territory. In these dangerous moments, when every movement had to be silent and every shot had to count, the simple Swedish submachine gun repeatedly proved its worth. And in time, its reputation would grow far beyond the muddy waterways where it first earned the trust of the men who carried it. By the late 1960s, the war in South Vietnam had entered a phase where intelligence and small unit operations were becoming increasingly important. Large conventional battles still occurred, but much of the conflict in the South unfolded in the shadows, along jungle trails, riverbanks, and remote villages scattered throughout the vast waterways of the Mekong Delta. For the small teams of the United States Navy SEALs operating there, every mission depended on speed, surprise, and precision. They were not meant to stay and hold ground. They were meant to appear suddenly, strike hard, gather information, and vanish before the enemy could react. One typical mission might begin hours before midnight. A SEAL platoon would load into a shallow patrol boat or a modified rivercraft, moving slowly through a maze of canals that twisted through mangrove forests and rice paddies. The engines would run only when necessary. Whenever possible, the boat crews preferred to drift or paddle quietly, letting the current carry them forward. In those moments, silence was everything. A single careless sound, the metallic click of equipment, a dropped magazine, the sudden crack of a rifle, could alert an entire village. Once that happened, the enemy would melt into the jungle, and the mission would be over. This was exactly the kind of environment where the Swedish submachine gun had begun to prove its value. The Carl Gustaf M45, or Swedish K, had already built a reputation among SEAL operators for reliability. But reliability alone was not enough. What truly elevated the weapon in the eyes of many special operators was how well it performed during the chaotic moments when stealth suddenly turned into violence. Imagine a SEAL team approaching a small riverside settlement at night. The men move quietly along the bank, stepping carefully to avoid splashing in the muddy water. A dim lantern burns inside one of the huts. Somewhere nearby, a guard patrols with an old rifle slung over his shoulder. If the guard notices movement, everything changes instantly. There is no time for careful aiming, no time for complex tactics. In those seconds, the outcome depends on speed and control. This is where the Swedish K's moderate rate of fire became extremely useful. At roughly 600 rounds per minute, the weapon produced short, controllable bursts that experienced shooters could guide onto a target with surprising accuracy. Instead of unleashing a wild spray of bullets, the operator could fire 2 or 3 rounds in a tight cluster. In close-range encounters, that control made the weapon devastatingly effective. And in the tight spaces common to the Delta, narrow pathways, bamboo huts, boat decks, a controllable burst could mean the difference between neutralizing a threat quickly or accidentally endangering teammates nearby. Another advantage came from the weapon's balance. With its tubular receiver and folding stock extended, the Swedish K handled more like a compact rifle than a pistol-sized submachine gun. This gave operators a stable shooting platform, even when firing from awkward positions. Consider the conditions inside a patrol boat during a sudden ambush. The craft might be rocking in the water, engines roaring as the crew attempts to escape a kill zone. Bullets snap through the air from hidden positions along the riverbank. In that chaos, soldiers are often forced to fire from unstable stances, bracing themselves against railings or crouching behind the hull. A weapon that is easy to control under those circumstances becomes incredibly valuable. Many SEAL veterans later recalled that the Swedish K seemed almost tailor-made for this kind of fighting. But the weapon's growing reputation did not mean that other firearms disappeared from the battlefield. Throughout the war, American forces experimented with a wide variety of weapons in an attempt to find the best tools for jungle combat. One of the most talked about alternatives was the Israeli-designed Uzi. By the 1960s, the Uzi had already earned a global reputation as a rugged and compact submachine gun. Its distinctive design placed the magazine inside the pistol grip, which shortened the weapon considerably and made it easy to carry inside vehicles or confined spaces. For many military and security units, the Uzi was an excellent choice. It was sturdy, simple to operate, and capable of delivering high volumes of fire in close combat. Around the world, it would eventually become one of the most recognizable submachine guns ever created. Yet among some SEAL teams in Vietnam, comparisons between the Uzi and the Swedish K often produced surprising results. Operators who had experience with both weapons frequently described subtle differences that mattered in the field. The Uzi, for example, tended to fire slightly faster. That higher rate of fire could be useful in some situations, but it also meant that bursts could climb more quickly, especially when firing one-handed or from unstable positions. The Swedish K's slower rhythm made it easier to keep bursts on target. Another factor involved suppressors. Although suppressors could be fitted to both weapons, many SEAL operators felt that the Swedish K produced smoother and more predictable results when used with them. The gun's straightforward blowback system and moderate rate of fire worked well with suppressed ammunition, allowing operators to maintain control while keeping the noise signature relatively low. But beyond these technical differences, something more intangible was shaping the preferences of the men carrying these weapons. Experience. In war, equipment earns its reputation through repeated exposure to danger. A weapon that performs flawlessly during training might still fail when exposed to mud, humidity, and the unpredictable chaos of combat. Conversely, a weapon that seems unimpressive on paper may reveal unexpected strengths once it is used in real operations. The Swedish K had now survived dozens of missions in the Delta. It had been dragged through swamp water, dropped in mud, and carried through thick jungle vegetation. Yet again and again, it continued to function when operators needed it most. Stories of its reliability spread quietly among SEAL teams. One veteran later described how the weapon could almost be abused without consequence. If the gun became clogged with dirt, it could usually be cleared quickly. If water entered the receiver during a river crossing, a quick shake was often enough to restore it to working order. In a war where so many variables were beyond a soldier's control, having a weapon that simply worked was a powerful source of confidence. But as the Swedish K's popularity grew among American special operators, an unexpected complication began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with engineering or battlefield performance. It had to do with politics. Sweden, the country that produced the Carl Gustaf M45, had maintained a position of neutrality in international conflicts. As the Vietnam War escalated and global opposition to the conflict increased, political pressure mounted inside Sweden regarding the export of military equipment to nations involved in the war. Eventually, the Swedish government decided to halt the export of the weapon. For American forces who had come to rely on the Swedish K, this decision created an immediate problem. Supplies of the weapon and its spare parts were limited, and without continued imports, maintaining the existing inventory would become increasingly difficult. Yet the demand for the gun among certain special operations units remained strong. Rather than abandoning the design entirely, American manufacturers took a different approach. They decided to build their own version. The result was the Smith Wesson M76. At first glance, the M76 looked remarkably similar to the Swedish weapon that inspired it. The tubular receiver, folding stock, and overall layout closely resembled the original Carl Gustaf design. Internally, the weapon followed the same general principles, a simple blowback mechanism designed for reliability and ease of maintenance. The goal was not to reinvent the concept, but to replicate the qualities that had made the Swedish K so useful in the first place. For special operators in Vietnam, the appearance of the M76 ensured that the basic design they trusted could continue to serve them in the field. Even as newer weapons continued to appear during the later years of the war, the influence of the Swedish K remained clear. Its success demonstrated something important about combat equipment. Sometimes the most effective tools are not the most advanced or technologically complex. Sometimes the best weapon is simply the one that works. And in the muddy canals, dense jungles, and dangerous night operations of the Mekong Delta, the humble Swedish submachine gun had proven exactly that. For many of the men who carried it, the Swedish K was not just another firearm. It was a piece of equipment that had helped them survive some of the most dangerous missions of their lives. Long after the war ended, That reputation would continue to follow the weapon. Because in the history of special operations, few firearms have earned such quiet respect from the men who trusted them when everything was on the line. By the late years of the Vietnam War, the operations conducted by the United States Navy SEALs in southern Vietnam had developed a very specific rhythm. The missions were rarely large, and they were almost never predictable. Instead, they revolved around intelligence, speed, and the ability to strike quietly in places where conventional forces could not easily operate. Most of these missions took place in the tangled waterways and muddy villages of the Mekong Delta, where the environment itself was often as dangerous as the enemy. A typical operation might begin long before sunset. Intelligence officers would receive information about a suspected courier, a weapons cache, or a Viet Cong political officer moving through a particular village. The information was rarely perfect. Sometimes it came from local informants, sometimes from captured documents, and sometimes from aerial reconnaissance that revealed suspicious movement along jungle trails or river channels. Once a target was identified, a SEAL team would begin planning. Unlike conventional assaults, SEAL raids depended heavily on timing. Teams preferred to arrive after midnight, when most villagers were asleep and the darkness offered maximum concealment. Boats would carry the operators along narrow canals, sometimes traveling for hours before reaching the insertion point. Engines were often shut down long before the target area. The final approach might be done by drifting silently with the current or paddling slowly between mangrove trees. In these moments, every detail mattered. Loose gear could clatter against the metal hull of a boat. A careless step could splash loudly in the water. Even the faint glow of a cigarette could betray a position in the darkness. The men moved carefully, aware that a single mistake could trigger a firefight before they even reached their objective. This was the environment where the Swedish submachine gun continued to prove its value. The Carl Gustaf M45 had become familiar to many SEAL operators by this stage of the war. Its simple metal frame, folding stock, and cylindrical suppressor had become a recognizable silhouette among the teams that favored it. Although other weapons remained in service, including rifles and different submachine guns, the Swedish K had carved out a special role in missions where stealth and close-quarters control were essential. Imagine one of these operations unfolding deep in the delta. The patrol boats stop several hundred meters from a small village. The SEAL team quietly climbs out, stepping into knee-deep mud along the riverbank. The water is warm and thick with silt, and the air smells of vegetation and stagnant canals. The team forms a loose column and begins moving toward the huts ahead, their boots sinking softly into the damp ground. At the front walks the point man. In his hands is the Swedish K, fitted with a suppressor that extends the length of the barrel. The weapon is held low but ready, the operator's finger resting near the trigger guard. He moves slowly, scanning the darkness between the huts and trees. Suddenly a shape appears near one of the buildings, a man sitting on a wooden stool, perhaps a guard or a lookout. For a moment, he seems unaware of the approaching figures. Then his head turns slightly, as if he has heard something. In a conventional firefight, the reaction might be immediate and explosive. But SEAL operations often demanded something different: speed without noise. The point man raises the Swedish K and fires a short burst. The suppressed weapon produces a dull mechanical thud rather than the sharp crack of an unsuppressed rifle. 2 or 3 rounds strike the target before he can shout a warning. The rest of the team continues moving. Moments like this illustrate why the weapon had earned such loyalty among operators. The Swedish K's moderate rate of fire allowed bursts to remain tight and controllable, even under stress. Instead of spraying a wide pattern of bullets, the shooter could deliver precise bursts that neutralized threats quickly. Inside the huts, the situation could change rapidly. Some raids involved capturing specific individuals rather than eliminating them. In these cases, the team had to move quickly through cramped spaces, identifying the target while controlling everyone else in the building. The narrow interiors of delta huts, bamboo walls, low ceilings, and small doorways created extremely tight engagement distances. Submachine guns were well suited for this kind of environment, but control was critical. A weapon that climbed excessively during bursts could send rounds into unintended areas. The Swedish K's balanced design helped operators keep the muzzle steady, even when firing quickly inside confined spaces. Outside the huts, the rest of the village often remained unaware of what was happening. The suppressor did not eliminate the sound entirely, but it reduced it enough that distant listeners might mistake the noise for something else. A door slamming, bamboo snapping, or a muffled mechanical sound carried by the wind. Within minutes, the team might have its target secured and be moving back toward the river. Extraction could be just as tense as the approach. Sometimes villagers or nearby fighters eventually realized something was happening. A shouted warning might echo across the water. Lights could appear in the distance. In those moments, stealth quickly gave way to speed. The SEAL team would rush back to the boats, engines roaring to life as the craft accelerated down the canal. If enemy fighters opened fire from the riverbanks, the operators returned fire while the boat crews maneuvered through the narrow channels. Here again, the Swedish K proved useful. Its controllable bursts made it effective even from unstable firing positions on moving boats. Operators could fire quick bursts toward muzzle flashes along the shoreline, forcing attackers to take cover while the boat escaped the kill zone. Over time, missions like these reinforced the weapon's reputation. It was not the most modern firearm in the American arsenal. It did not feature advanced materials or complex engineering. But in the harsh conditions of the Delta, its simplicity became its greatest strength. Meanwhile, the comparisons between the Swedish K and the Uzi continued to circulate among soldiers and weapons enthusiasts. Both guns had strengths, and both proved capable in close combat. The Uzi's compact size and rugged construction made it an excellent weapon for many roles. Around the world, it would go on to serve with military and police forces for decades. Yet among certain SEAL teams in Vietnam, the Swedish K retained a special place. Part of that preference came from the specific demands of riverine warfare. The longer receiver and folding stock gave the Swedish weapon a slightly more stable feel when firing bursts, especially when shooting from boats or awkward jungle positions. The moderate rate of fire made it easier to control during rapid engagements, and its performance with suppressors aligned well with the stealth-focused tactics used in many SEAL operations. As the war progressed and Sweden halted exports of the original weapon, the United States ensured that the design would not disappear from the battlefield. Domestic production of the Smith Wesson M76 provided American forces with a locally manufactured version of the Swedish concept. While not identical in every detail, the M76 preserved the basic characteristics that had made the Carl Gustaf design so successful. Even as newer weapons appeared in later years, the legacy of the Swedish K continued to influence the thinking of special operations units. Its success reinforced an important lesson about combat equipment. Complexity is not always an advantage. In environments where mud, water, and rough handling are constant realities, simplicity can be the difference between success and failure. For the SEAL teams who operated in the Mekong Delta, the Swedish K became more than just a piece of hardware. It became part of the identity of those dangerous missions. Silent approaches through mangrove channels, sudden raids on jungle villages, and fast escapes down narrow waterways before the enemy could react. Years later, veterans of those operations would still remember the weapon fondly. Many of them described it not in terms of technical specifications, but in terms of trust. It was a gun that worked when they needed it, in places where failure could mean disaster. And in the unpredictable darkness of Vietnam's waterways, that reliability was worth more than any advanced feature. Because in the end, the reason many Navy SEALs preferred the Swedish K over the Uzi was not about nationality or design trends. It was about survival. In the mud, water, and jungle of Vietnam, the weapon that saved your life was the one you remembered. And for many SEAL operators, that weapon was a simple Swedish submachine gun that had quietly earned its reputation in the most dangerous missions of the war.